Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in our virtual book discussion. I'm Suzanne Inawi, Marketing Manager for AUC Press and Hoopoe Fiction imprint. And our book discussion today should last about an hour, and it's currently being recorded, and it's live on our Facebook page for AUC Press. And the recording will be available afterwards, also on our YouTube channel, so make sure to follow. We're going to have some room for Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screens. And for those watching on Facebook, you can type your questions in the comments section and make sure that they're asked on your behalf. So before we begin, we would like to take a moment to remember our late author and Egyptian novelist, Hamdi Abu Ghlayl, who passed away unexpectedly and suddenly on Sunday. We share our deepest condolences to his family, friends, and readers around the world. Abu Ghlayl actually reviewed today's novel, Suleiman's Reign. You're going to find it on the cover. And we're so saddened by this news of losing a very valuable author and esteemed author. So, on another and now more positive note, we're going to talk today about Suleiman's Reign by Egyptian-American novelist Sherif Meleka and translated by Raymond, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. You can order a copy from major bookstores worldwide and online book retailers. And in Egypt, you could easily find it in AUC bookstores or Diwan bookstores. A little bit about Hoopoe is the fiction imprint of AUC Press. And it's for the engaged, open-minded readers hungry for outstanding fiction that challenges headlines. And it's about fiction from the Middle East, reimagined, with reimagined histories and celebrates original storytelling. And Hoopoe Fiction was launched in March 2016, and so far we have a little bit over 25 novels, if not more. And Suleiman's Reign is one of our newest novels published in spring 2023. And this novel has received so far so many positive reviews from international media. And recently it was described by the Canadian Jewish News as dazzling epic novel. And the time you read, not just for its powerful depiction of Jews in modern Egypt, but for its exploration of themes of nationhood, societal divisions, both along political and identity lines, and the influence that individuals can have on an entire society. So we're very delighted to have with us today our author, Sherif Meleka, who is a trained medical doctor, and he immigrated from Egypt to the United States in 1984. He's the author of numerous novels, poetry, and short story collections, and in Arabic. And Suleiman's Reign is his second novel, published in 2008 in Arabic, and this is his English language debut. And he currently lives in Jacksonville, Florida, USA. And our discussant and moderator today is Marcia Lynx Qualey, the founding editor of ArabLit and ArabLit Quarterly, and the co-host of the Melaka podcast, and her translations of Sonia Nim's time-traveling Thunderbird trilogy and Haya Saleh young adult novel Wild Poppies were published in 2022 and 2023. So please join me in welcoming our guest speakers. And I'm now going to leave the floor to Marcia. Thank you. Take it from there.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you, Sherif, for being here today. And thank you to both to the people who are in the audience live and to everyone who comes to watch later. So Suzanne gave a little bit of a description of the novel, and the description, hi Mona, the description calls it a magical realist novel, although I think we'll leave that a little bit open to interpretation about whether the ring really has magical powers or the magic is in the eyes of the beholders. To give just a kind of a capsule introduction to people who haven't read it already, the novel begins when a young Gamal Abdel Nasser approaches two men, a Jew who's nominally converted to Christianity for the sake of his wife, Dawood, and a Muslim brother, both for help in defeating the British. Dawood, who later passes the ring to his son Suleiman, the Suleiman of the title, got the ring from a jewelry dealer who told him that the ring was the reason for the extraordinary musical abilities of Said Darwish, and Dawood also played the oud. The ring may or may not have helped Gamal Abdel Nasser survive his assassination attempt, a soldier survive the October War, a controversial thinker avoid an attack by the Brotherhood, and fuel Dawood's own brief but extraordinary rise. The novel parallels major events and historical figures in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Egypt, ending shortly after Sadat's assassination. He was not wearing the ring, and follows shifting social movements and attitudes. And particularly, I thought movingly shows how people can be foreignized in their own homeland. So thank you again, Sherif, for joining me in this discussion. And I want to start with Gamal Abdel Nasser, who appears really quite early in the novel and dynamically kind of arrives, as a very big, larger than life character. Because I think it's such a challenge to depict a historical figure who still lives on in our shared memory, and a person about whom people have really strong opinions. I think it's one thing to write about, Henry VIII, like Hilary Mantel does, or Ibn Battuta, but another thing to write about a historical figure that people still have a stake in today. And I wondered about what considerations went into how you crafted the character of Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Well, thank you very much for asking these very intelligent questions. As I was telling you before we went on air, that these were very fresh questions that nobody else had raised with the book being published in 2008. I had many discussions, and this is one of the questions that were never asked in previous discussions. Indeed, it was a challenge. It was necessary for me to do a thorough research about Gamal Abdel Nasser before I started writing the novel. For many reasons. One is that I was a young child when Gamal Abdel Nasser was in power. He died when I was just 12 years old. So I have never experienced these live events myself. So it was all through my readings and my exposure and my preparation before I started writing. The second reason is what you very well mentioned. Nasser had a lot of followers, and I had to be very careful not to upset them because they also constitute the majority of Arabic literature critics and readers and writers, of course, in the Arab world. So I had to tread over thin ice there. I remember I had a good friend of mine who had since passed, Dr. Rushdie Said. I don't know, a lot of people know him. He's a very prominent figure, he was. And during the Nasser era, he was very close to the ruling faction in Egypt. So he was very strong Nasserite. And in our meetings, we always argued. I did not view Nasser with such a high regards, unlike him. And he always argued with me to try to convince me of his virtues. And then I wrote the novel and I presented to him, and I left for a while and let him read the novel, and then he called me. And he was fascinated by the novel, and especially of how I depicted Nasser in the novel. He was surprised I did not, show my opinions of Nasser, because this is not my job. I don't believe the writer has to impose his views on the reader. I think the characters have to show up with their views, with their character, with their political inclinations, not the writer. So he was very pleased with that, and this was what went on with the depiction of Nasser. Also, the third reason why I had to be very careful was that these activities or events were so fresh in people's minds yet, so not forgotten. So I had to be very careful not to mention something wrong, that something did not happen at that time or whatever. So I had to do my homework pretty well before I started writing.
Right.
And I think I enjoyed it very much because I saw Gamal Abdel Nasser for the first time in my life on the pages of my novel. So he came alive. He came into life in front of me all of a sudden.
Yeah, no, I think it comes across clearly that he's a very charismatic person with a big, larger than life person. And then from that point, yeah, we do see him through the lenses of different characters. And some are certainly critical of him. And
exactly.
So, yeah, I think you do, and it's wonderful to imagine that even for a Nasserist, they were pleased with your portrait.
Yes.
So to me, one of the big turning points in the novel is the assassination attempt in October 1954 by the Brotherhood, which is also both a historical event and event that changes the lives of the characters of the book. So you said you had to be careful, of course, because these things are fresh in the reader's memories. So you don't want to say that this assassination attempt happened in 1955 and get the date wrong. But I wondered what else you feel is do you feel a responsibility while writing a historical novel to present history in a certain way, or do you feel a freedom to sort of reinvent certain things? What can you reinvent and what can't you reinvent?
Well, I think I'm going to speak for myself because a lot of authors do not agree with my philosophy about writing. So a lot of authors under the title of fiction feel free to do whatever they want with their characters. So they do not have to abide with certain facts or certain appearances or even now there is a big hoopla about Cleopatra being depicted as by a black actress. And this is, especially in this era we're living in, the author or the creator of a fictional work, they feel free to do whatever they want. So they want to make Cleopatra African-American, they can. They want to make Shakespeare Chinese, they can. So anything goes in today's mind. I don't ascribe to that notion. I think that the character and the events have to be accurately depicted, but within the structure and the fabric of the novel that I'm creating. So that requires a lot of preparation on my part to accomplish that. So I have to do the reading. I have to do a lot of reading before I wrote this novel, and we can talk about this in the coming questions. But I wanted to create Gamal Abdel Nasser, for example, as I saw him during interviews, during his political speeches, as I read about interviews that they had with him. So his voice became alive in my mind, and the events of his lifetime with 1954 assassination or 1967 war with Israel, or before that in 1948 when he was fighting on behalf of the Egyptian army against Israeli forces. So all these I have read about, and I've read a lot of anecdotes also about his life and about his applying for the army, the Egyptian army, and he had to get somebody to push him to be accepted. And this event he recalled in his memoirs, and I put it in my novel. And as he was talking to Dawood and Sheikh Hassan al-Basri, he told them the story, and this again required a lot of research before I put anything in writing, because I believe that the voice of the writer has to be real, so that the words would be believable in the eyes of the reader.
Mm. So if you can bring yourself back to 2000, I don't know, when did you start working on the novel? Do you remember?
I started in around October of 2006.
Okay.
I was driving my car.
Yes, okay.
In Maryland, and I was probably sent shopping by my wife or something like that. But I was very upset at the time of how things have become of Egypt.
Okay.
Egypt was not politically doing well, and the middle class was devastated, and the majority of Egyptians, their living conditions was poor. And I did not know what to do. And then all of a sudden, it occurred to me, what if I had the Ring of Solomon?
Mm.
What did I do with it to change Egypt's fate? And I said to myself, well, I don't know. What would I do? Where do I start? And then another idea occurred to me. So what if Solomon himself was in Egypt in 2006? What would he do with his ring, magical ring? And then it occurred to me, why don't I write about this? Why don't I usually like to write so that I get the answers, not the other way around. So I get the answers, and therefore I write them. I like to see what my characters will do to teach me about life and about solving problems and things like that. And so I imagined that Solomon was in Egypt now, and I wanted to see what he would do with his magical ring. Then it occurred to me a few seconds later, why don't I bring David, King David, the father of Solomon, of King Solomon, because he's a favorite character of mine. I personally like King David a lot because of his humanity and his weaknesses, and yet he's being a king and leading the whole Israel. So I thought of him as an introduction to Solomon. So I brought him in as a oud player, because David was a oud player also. And I brought him in as nobody, and I wanted to see what he would do when he becomes king. So this is how it started.
Excellent. So then, so why did you decide to set it in the past, and why in that era, not in 2006, for instance?
Well, it had to end in modern times. So I started early on to allow David to grow into becoming a king, and then see what Solomon will do with his ring.
Okay.
So started in the 1940s to see when he acquired the ring in 1951, when he met with Gamal Abdel Nasser. And then I also wanted to bring the recent history of Egypt, because this is how the problems that I was feeling in 2006 had emanated from. So I wanted to see where things got south, and see what these guys would do with it.
Right. So you're driving in your car, possibly doing errands, and you have this idea. And then what's your process after that? What do you start doing research or mapping out the novel, or what exactly do you do now?
Well, I started writing and then I stopped because I also at that time and up until last year was a full-time physician. And so I did not have the liberty of writing whenever I wanted and doing research whenever I wanted, etc., etc. So I usually would start with a paragraph or two or a page or something like that and then stop. And then I would go and read and go and see patients and go and do stuff like that with my family. And it took me about 2 years to write this novel because it's not easy to write it. It spans a lot of years and a lot of very important events in the modern history of Egypt. And I had to do a lot of research about King David, about King Solomon after that. And also I made sure to take up the Quran about these characters and how they were depicted in the Quran. And for instance, there is something very poetic in the depiction of King Solomon when he was about to see the Queen of Sheba. And the Quran warned him that she might be the devil in the clothes of the woman. And the way to find out is to look at her legs. If she had the legs of a sheep or something like that, hairy legs, then she is the devil. So he took her in a special room in his palace or castle or whatever. And this room had water on the floor that acted like a mirror because it was still water and very thin layer of water. And he could see the reflection of her legs to find out if she were human or a genie or a devil. So I did that in my novel when Suleiman was seeing this beautiful woman in Alexandria. She was walking on the shore of the seashore, and her legs were reflected in the waves of the water, and they were human legs, and they're very nice ones. So that's how he knew that she was real.
Right. Then this is Qamar, who later becomes his lover very briefly.
Yes.
Yes, and yeah, there's a moment where we don't know, is she real? Is she a figment of his imagination? Is she a jinn? Is she from another dimension? What is she? And she turns out to be a woman.
Yes, that's true. So I depicted this from the Quran. And so there was a lot of research that went on as I was writing, and I could not have made up all this from my imagination and without really having solid readings before writing each chapter.
And so what do you think this adds, this layer of David and Solomon, Dawood and Suleiman to the novel in terms of, so the reader comes and are you expecting the reader to recognize that this is a Quranic story, or it's just?
No, I wanted to relay the possible magic of the ring. So the idea had to be fortified by these illusions. And surprisingly, most people who read the novel did not pick on that. I thought that it was too obvious And I did not like that, for instance, in some of the works of Mahfouz, when he wrote about the children of Gibalawi or Awlad Haritna, or the children of the alley, whatever the translation is, that the depiction of the historic characters is so obvious. And I did not want to be that obvious in my depiction of King David and of Solomon. And it wasn't actually, a lot of people did not pick on that.
Well, I didn't either. So I just want to say quickly, thank you to everybody who has put in questions already. Keep putting them in, and we'll reserve the last, say, 10 minutes for questions. So you talked about being a doctor and having to balance that with your writing. I saw that you were briefly public health inspector at Tora Prison, and to me, one of the really moving moments of the novel is this relationship between two characters who meet in prison. One's Muslim Brotherhood, and who rises to be a leader in the Brotherhood, and one is a writer and sort of a secularist,
liberal thinker.
Yeah. A secular thinker. You'd say he's Muslim, but a secular thinker.
Yeah.
And they have a friendship there in prison, and then it's a little bit crushing that this relationship, this friendship doesn't sort of transform their relations on the outside. So it's something that kind of only exists in this part in prison. And I wondered if some of what you wrote was from your personal experience with not as a prisoner, but being in the moment. Yeah,
well, actually it's not. My experience as a health officer in Tora was much later in life. So it was in the 1980s. And the Islamic prisoners at that time were completely different from the Islamists of the Brotherhood. They were more fundamentalists. They're more like Al-Qaeda and ISIS nowadays. So I had different experiences with them. They were very rough, and they had a leader in the prison, Amir. And this Amir, I went there for vaccination of the whole prison against cholera. There was an epidemic then. And the Amir refused to let his followers come and get the vaccines. And he sent me a messenger to tell me that they will not receive the vaccine. So I told the messenger, listen, if I leave now, I'll be very happy because I'm going to only work for 2 hours and I'll have the rest of the day for myself. And I don't care, but I want you to tell him that all these people are going to die because of him. So he needs to let me know within half an hour exactly his final decision. Otherwise, I will leave, and it will be his responsibility. And the messenger came back and told me, okay, he agreed. So, exactly. But it was a different, the Muslim Brotherhood don't act like this. They are very savvy and they know what to do. They don't have this fundamentalist mentality about them. So this is the part about the relationship with my working at Torah. But the relationship between the secular, modern thinker and the Brotherhood was only successful in a neutral environment. So they could do it in the prison and they could have a discussion. There was no threat of using violence. The discussion was going back and forth like ping pong, and everyone was allowed to say everything he wants freely without fear. Once they went outside, the game was changed. They had a discussion at the end of the book when in Suleiman's meeting room, and the secular Rashad Fikri could not voice his opinions because the people around the Sheikh Buri opposed this and were violent and did a hubbub and would not allow this to happen. And actually, after that, he was murdered. So this is the difference in the medium where these discussions take place. So we can talk about it, write about it, but then a knife or a bullet or whatever can end the discussion by someone who is ordered to do it. And this happened with Mahfouz, it happened with lately with Salman Rushdie and so forth and so on. Many types of assassinations or attempts at assassinations had occurred between the two factions that were discussing this freely and successfully in the between under the walls of the prison.
Yeah, to me, this is the most emotionally difficult parts of the novel are when this, relationships, deep friendships, such as, Dawood and Hassan in the beginning, and Rashad and Al-Buri in the prison, and with the Gamal Abdel Nasser's father as well, are undercut by these social movements that, that as I told you, it's that love doesn't conquer all.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
So there have been this wave of Arabic novels foregrounding Jewish characters in the last 15 years or so, and I would say yours comes at the kind of the beginning of this wave.
Yes.
Ali al-Maqri, Amin Zawi, Ali Badr, several in Egypt. The Last Jews of Alexandria, this trilogy by Kamal Al-Hayem that AUC also published in translation. And I wondered why you think there has been this interest in writing about Jewish characters in the 21st century, Jewish characters in the mid 20th century across the region, and whether you see your novel as part of this in some way.
Well, I don't see my novel like you mentioned, that this was the beginning of such writings because it was published in 2008. And when I published it, the late Iraqi writer, Khudair Miri, I don't know if you know him or not, he was a wonderful person and he wrote a couple of very nice novels. And he actually was the main discussion group when the novel came out. And on the way after, he spoke very highly of the novel, but in the car afterwards, he told me, "What are you doing to yourself? No one is going to read your work. No one is going to mention you until you die. This is a no man's land. You don't write about a Jewish character in Alexandria. This is unheard of." And I think that this new wave that happened afterwards was the result of the era of the strong nationalists in the whole Middle East subsiding. The wave of these nationalists had subsided and allowed for people to freely discuss this important topic, because across the Arab world and the Middle East in general, those people were pushed out of their countries and pushed out from their places of birth and where their families were, and they were, overwhelmingly mistreated because of their religion. There was no other reason than the religion. And so this nationalist era passed. People felt free to talk about this silent agony that they had, and they had now the freedom to discuss it, and so they spoke about it. But it is like the Turks and how they treat the Armenian massacres, and only recently people started to write about it and to discuss these things. So it's not easy in the Middle East because of the tight grip of the ruling faction all over the Middle East. But I was freed by being here, and I could think and write more clearly. There was no pressure on me to pick a certain subject over the other. And also I found out that I liked to write about the minorities, the oppressed. Most of my work is about women, about children, about homosexuals, about the unfortunate, the Coptic Christian, the Egyptian Christians. So they're depicted throughout my work in poetry, in stories, short stories, and in novels. To the point that people are telling me, oh, you're not just writing about minorities, you should write about the majority too. No, a lot of people are writing about the majority. That's enough. I think that is more than enough exposure. So when they tell me that you only depict minorities and these characters live in Egypt, and in Egypt there are a majority of Muslims, I say, read Mahfouz, read Yusuf Idris, read any Egyptian writer. Their work is full of mosques and dervishes and prayers, and it's enough. You've shared. So let me talk about the people that are invisible. The people that nobody had talked about before. I asked Naim personally that question: why didn't you write about Christians in your novels, or very little? So he said, that I wrote very little, yes, I admit, but I wasn't exposed to a lot of Christians in my life. So that is not, maybe it was his particular life, but the Christians are a big minority in Egypt, and they are present throughout society. No one had lived their life without being exposed to Christians.
Yeah, and sort of the position that Dawood is in the 1950s and 1960s is in some ways analogous to a position that the Copts are in later, also in some ways being sort of foreignized in Egypt. Yes,
that's true. But the Copts are a lot more, number-wise, than the Jews were, even at the highest level of their existence in Egypt. They were not even 1/10 the number of Christians in Egypt.
Yeah, and in your novel, unlike any of the other novels that I've read about Jewish characters in this region, I began to think of an analogy of how Japanese people were treated in the United States when they were put into internment camps, how their loyalty was questioned because of that reason. Really see the moment when, you know, his loyalty is questioned for no reason. There's nothing to suggest that he might be loyal to Israel.
Exactly. The difference is that in United States or in Germany, after what they did to the Jews, and in other places in Spain, all this was immediately reconciled with and immediately dealt with. Mm. And it was not left for centuries or decades at least without anybody talking about it. So the big difference between how societies dealt with these black spots in their history. They could fast or rapidly uncover from this. And we see that in Egypt nowadays with the Christians, you know, since the new revolution and the El-Sisi coming together, there is a lot of change in the views of the Christian minority in Egypt.
I was really struck by how different titles are so meaningful in the book. And, you know, we come to sort of flinch every time someone says Juega to Daoud, because he, you know, he's like, I can't hear you. I'm not responding to this. Because he's not, you know, he's Ustaz, he's Mu'allim, he's Besha, I don't know, but he's not a foreigner. And there are other aspects of how he's foreignized, you know, his loyalty is questioned, but this one is so insistent. And I wondered why you chose to focus on that in particular.
Well, maybe because it's true.
Okay.
So all the Jews were referenced to as Khawaga. All Christians, or most of the Christians, were also referred to, especially in Upper Egypt, as Khawaga. And in some ways, I felt that I was a Khawaga for, you know, to a certain extent. Of course, I lived in Cairo. I was born in Alexandria. So these are more open societies. But if you go in the Delta or in Upper Egypt, to this day, the Christians are often referred to as Khawaga Fulan. So this is not unheard of. So that's why. And then, like I said, you know, I like to focus on the oppressed, the unjustly treated, and this is my fate. This is what I am here for. That's why I'm writing.
Okay, so before we go on with any other questions from me, I thought we had better take some questions from the audience so we don't miss out on that. First is, hi Sherif, I'm very proud to be one of your old neighbors and friends. Enjoying your brief talk about the book. Would like to ask, what was your feelings for the first time you held the English edition of your novel?
Well, I was very happy. I spent my entire life with, entire life since I immigrated, since I became a husband, a father, a doctor in America. All the people around me saw that I was writing, but this was the first time they could read what I was writing. What I was bragging about came true, because now they could see what is Sherif Meleka doing, writing. So I was very, very pleased. This was a dream of mine, and it was a dream come true. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank the AUC Press for allowing me to budge into their busy schedule and to allow me to be translated. Because usually they only translate novels that win awards. And my being in the United States, no one was interested in giving me any awards. So I took my novel. I had 5 chapters that were translated by Raymond, and everybody in AUC press knew who he was. So they looked into it and they approved my novel for translation, and hopefully many more.
Inshallah. So another question from Nahel. Some scenes in the book were very hard to read due to the painful events they depict. The torture scene in detention and Qamar's suicide come to mind. I'm curious what scene was hard for you to write personally? And that's from Nahel.
Well, the most painful was Dawood's death. I fell in love with Dawood, the character, in my novel, and I was struggling to keep him alive. I knew that he was going to die, and I was using all my conniving skills to keep him around. And I refused to let him die. So the scene of his death reflects that. It's very lengthy, and the guy was, a voice behind him was telling him, Khawaja Dawood, Khawaja Dawood, and he was running away from this voice as if he was trying to escape this depiction of Khawaja, 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 I'm not Khawaja, and he was running away from this voice, and he, at the end, fell through, his life ended, because in my mind, the Jews in Egypt had died with 1967 defeat to Israel. And this was an eventual thing that had to happen. The characters had to die, even though I, the author, did not want him to die. And so when he died, I started crying. And I went upstairs to my bedroom. My wife saw me crying. And she said, what happened? I said, Dawood died. She said, Dawood who? She thought it was one of our relatives or something. And I told her it was a character in my novel. So this was the saddest part. Of course, you know, Amar's death also was very painful because she took her life because of depression and because of how she viewed her life, and she viewed that everybody around her was dying because of her. And this was also very painful. Because also I loved her freshness, her you know, she's not very sophisticated, but she's beautiful and fresh and naive in a way. And it was very painful to see her die.
Mm.
But a lot of people also were upset because the ring fell, and they were hoping that somebody good will get the ring. But you know, I did not know what, you know, why the characters did that. It's not up to me.
Mm.
I just write what they tell me to do.
I thought that I hate the worst part was when Dawood died. I wasn't sure if we could mention it because it's a little bit of a spoiler, but I guess as you say, he had to die, but it was terrible. I didn't want him to. Another question, what has influenced your writing over the years?
Life. I think pain patients are a big source of why I started to write, because in the pain patients usually come to see me and they undo their souls in front of me. They take out any guards that they put in life in general. And they are so sad by all their failures to get better and to be treated with this surgery or this particular treatment or injections or whatever. And they come to me in a desperate state that I felt drained at the end of the day, and I wanted to read and write afterwards to rejuvenate my energy, to re-energize. And this was the main cause of me pointing towards writing. But it wasn't a decision. It wasn't something that I had thought ever to be a writer. It just happened.
Mona Namouri wants to know, what do you think of the English translation? Was it successful in conveying your ideas, personal register, and nuances of meaning?
I do. Actually, I was privileged to work closely with Raymond, and each chapter that he wrote, he would send it to me. I would re-edit it according to the original text and do mistakes, fix them, find. There is a lot of difficulties with the Egyptian part of the Arabic text, because there is, in this particular novel, all the dialogue is in colloquial Egyptian dialect. And sometimes the translation, when you look into dictionary or something like that, the word becomes completely different than the meaning of the writing. And so, because I have some command of the English language, I could easily see those mistakes and correct them before the final book was issued. But Raymond is also very poetic in his work. And so he writes poetry himself. And so this reflected the poetic way the novel was written in Arabic. So yeah, it was a very successful translation. I hope that continues with my, I have 9 other novels so far that need to be translated, and I have short stories, collections, and many poems. So I'm hoping that
the translators who are now in the audience can reach out to you about possibly translating your other work.
I hope so.
Okay. Yes, well, so that there is another question that says, I'm always so proud of you, my friend. The question is, why not translate your other books? And I think,
Inshallah.
sure, why not?
All in good times.
Yes. So I don't know, we have, say, 5 minutes left. I want to sneak in one more of my questions.
Yeah.
I've read elsewhere where you said you admired the works of Mahfouz, Sadat Jahin, Tawfiq al-Hakim, and I wondered what books you read as a young person that sort of formed your literary tastes and what you're reading nowadays.
Well, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I grew up reading Mahfouz. Even though I was young, I had good command of the Arabic language, so that I understood Mahfouz pretty well. And I grew up also reading Yusuf Idris. He was much easier to read than Mahfouz. And of course, earlier I was reading the books of something called Maktaba al-Khadra, the Green Library. It had international stories for children. I also read Al-Mughammirun al-Khamsa, the 5 adventurers. Also, this also was running in Maadi, where I am from. So it was very familiar, the streets and the club and where the police station is and all the stuff. I was very familiar with those. But growing up, I read mostly literature. For some reason, I loved that. And I also read a lot of poetry. I read a lot of Salah Jahin and Nizar Qabbani, the Syrian poet. And also I was in a French school, so we had to read a lot of classic French early on Racine, Molière, and later on Voltaire. And then, when we got older, we started reading Victor Hugo and Gustave Flaubert. And I also read a lot of English literature because we started reading or studying English in the 3rd grade. So we had pretty good command of the English language as well. But I did not become an avid reader really until I married my wife. She is a very good reader. She reads all the time, 2 or 3 books at once. And so she encouraged me with this atmosphere. My son also, and my daughter to a lesser extent, they like to read. And so this atmosphere really brought in reading as part of our lifestyle. So we read a lot. And I read a lot of literature, books, especially now that I'm retired. I read usually during the day in English, and at night, before I go to bed, I read in Abjad, one of the novels of modern Arabic writers. I have to confess, I'm more inclined to read the classical writings, but some of them are very good.
Well, it's nice to know that your wife is also a reader, so she was sympathetic when you said you were crying because Dawood had died.
Yes, and she, gave me the best part about this novel when she finished reading it, and she said, "Well, you are a great writer. I'm so happy I could finally read your work," because she has never had the opportunity to read anything. I've been writing since 2000, and for 23 years she sees me locked up in a room and blocked out completely. She talks to me, I would not even hear her, and she didn't know what for. What is this that he's writing? And this was the first time she could actually read what I was writing. So it was very good.
Excellent. So I'm going to hand the microphone back to Suzanne.
Thank you, Marcia. I have to admit, this was really a wonderful discussion. I'm sure our attendees agree. And Marcia, we'd like to thank you so much, behalf of AUC Press, for taking the time to moderate this session. You always add a different angle and questions that usually Suzanne, like myself, can't really think of because of all of your expertise. So thank you so much for your time and effort. And Dr. Sherif Meleka, thank you so much for actually bringing this novel to our world. And we're so glad that it's available in English worldwide. So everybody read it, all your friends, and also our global readers around the world. You can find it in major bookstores and online booksellers like Amazon. I know we don't like to promote it, but it's easily found. And you can also read it in ebook version, available as Kindle as well. And if you'd like to add any last word, Dr. Sherif, before we conclude today.
No, I just want to thank you very much for organizing this, and it was very well done. Thank you very much for AUC Press in general, and to you specifically. And we'll see each other again, I'm sure.
Sure. And I also would like to thank the attendees, everyone who joined us and watched online, and those who sent the questions. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Bye,
everyone. Bye.